So, continuing our conversation about the Middle Ages and the role that the Middle Ages played, the invaluable role that the Middle Ages played in the emergence of the modern world, modernity being, roughly dated from 1500 to present. We can think about this not only from the context of was Europe during the Middle Ages a dark age or not. We could also think about this from the standpoint of rebirth or culmination. So during the Renaissance, Renaissance of course means rebirth. The Italian Renaissance is often characterized as, at the time, an imagining of a rebirth of the age of antiquity, so the Hellenistic age when Greco-Roman influence sort of dominated the ancient world. And of course, we mentioned, of course, the Middle Ages beginning is generally dated with the formal collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE or AD. So in the Renaissance, many of your thinkers of the Renaissance would naturally think the Middle Ages was a dark age, and that they were somehow bringing back the golden era, if you will, of antiquity, and sort of the Dark Ages had nothing great to offer and was of no great importance. In reality, of course, the Middle Ages is really a culmination more than it is a rebirth, meaning that developments and things like the Renaissance owed themselves to developments in the Middle Ages. The emergence of early level sort of capitalism, the roots of banking, for example, in places like Italy, the Medici family in Florence is really usually associated with the development of banking, early capitalism, if you will, in the Western world. But a lot of the earlier developments in those areas of the economy also owed themselves to expansion in economics and trade that was particularly profoundly influencing areas like the Amalfi Coast in Italy, cities like Pisa, Barcelona, Spain, and so on. This is very much more of a culmination. And of course, when we look at Norman England, that's very, very obvious, right? We talked about the Normans in the earlier lecture, that the Normans had, that they were originally Vikings who settled down in the area that is known as Normandy, adopted many French customs and language, religion, assimilating while also holding on to certain elements of their own culture. And of course, in 1066, William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings would conquer England as a result of his claim to the throne and begin the Norman, really the growth of what was really a Norman empire in England, Ireland, and even extending into southern Italy and Sicily for a time. The Norman role in England, of course, during the Middle Ages, gave roots to the very foundation of what we'd ultimately call in England the English rights of man and citizen, eventually, which occurred at the very end of the 17th century, in the 1600s. And of course, also the emergence of the American Bill of Rights owed itself to a large degree in terms of influence to the Magna Carta. Representative government owed itself to a large degree Edward I, the formation of Parliament for the purposes of raising taxes for the various conflicts that King Edward was dealing with around about 1300. So really more of a culmination. Middle-aged Europe, though, also was highly innovative in a number of areas. One particularly being engineering and building. You are looking here at the most famous of the Gothic cathedrals. This, of course, is Notre Dame in Paris. These are photos that I took. This is the most well-renowned and remembered, if you will, Gothic cathedral. Though it began as sort of a Romanesque cathedral and took on the Gothic form during the High Middle Ages, Gothic cathedrals really represented a truly innovative and a truly middle-aged, European middle-aged style of building. And of course, they're also symptomatic of the power of the age, as we'll talk about in a little bit. These massive cathedrals, which took generations to build, of course, also symbolized where the real power in society was with the church during the Middle Ages. Gothic cathedrals, what made them unique are things called vaulted ceilings and flying buttresses. So, a Gothic cathedral, I'll show you the inside. Here you see inside, this is the inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame. This is inside Bayeux Cathedral, which is the cathedral that, of course, William the Conqueror, the Norman king who conquered England, was actually coronated in. It's in Bayeux, France, in Normandy. So if you ever travel to Normandy, you basically have to go to Bayeux. It's where the Bayeux Tapestry is. It's an incredible location. But if you look here, these are vaulted ceilings, and even these photos, I mean, you can see how small the people are. You get a feeling for how high these ceilings are. And this is a unique element of Gothic engineering. Now, the way the vaulted ceilings worked, you had these kind of relatively thin stone walls, very, very high arching ceilings. And what really made the Gothic cathedral work were flying buttresses. This is outside of Bayeux Cathedral, and right here, you see this little arm, if you will? This is one of the buttresses. These flying buttresses create the ability to create these high, just sky-reaching ceilings. This is the Duomo in Milan, and I'm going to show you the Duomo in Milan, one of the more iconic Gothic cathedrals, has a great look at the flying buttresses. And this is an example you can see close up, because at the Duomo in Milan, you can walk up here on the roof, and these flying buttresses on the outside allow for the walls to be supported, held up, and for these large vaulted ceilings to occur. The Middle Ages as well witnessed, and of course it's an event like the 100 Years' War and also the Black Death, that are some of the factors in why the Middle Ages got the moniker of a dark age, because prior to the emergence of the Renaissance, prior to the emergence of, if you will, the birth of the modern world, as we typically date, again around 1500, the world witnessed some serious calamities. There was famine at the beginning of the 1300s. There was, of course, the Black Death, which I will talk about in a moment. And there was also the longest running European war in the history of Europe. And this was the 100 Years' War. Now, it did not run consistently for 100 years. There were 4 phases to it. You'd have a period of time where the war would occur, then there would be some kind of ceasefire, peace agreement sort of thing, and then there would be a lull, and then the war would reignite again. And there were 4 phases. The war was fought between England and France. And knowing what we talked about with the Normans and where the Normans came from, it really shouldn't be a surprise, because the Normans came from northern France. They were originally Vikings, of course, or Danes, and they came from northern France. Their domains in northern France, as a group in northern France, they were actually vassals. Vassal meaning a subordinate to, owing homage to, owing service to a greater lord or king. They were, in fact, vassals in France to the French king. Well, over time, of course, that as the Normans became more and more powerful, as they controlled England and established their own empire, really, again, stretching all the way to southern Italy and Sicily, one might assume that there will probably be territorial disputes between France and England, and this culminated in a devastating war. And the war really involved a claim, Edward III of England, who actually was the rightful heir, if you actually looked at the typical ways that heirs' rights to crowns was determined, which is through marriage and family connections. England III was actually the rightful heir in a legal sense. And so England's Edward III claimed basically a right to be the King of France. But unsurprisingly, the lords in France refused to acknowledge Edward's claim to the crown, and this resulted in this conflict. This miniature, this painting here, is of King Edward III counting the dead at the Battle of Crécy. This was one of the most destructive battles of the war, certainly of the early phase of the war. And this was an English victory. This was fought near the English Channel, near the area of Calais, the closest point between France and England. The war really demonstrated it was unique in how it was fought in a lot of senses. So France had large armies that they could call up in the French territories. The English, by contrast, really relied on smaller groups that would seek to attack, win quick victories, and then effectively retreat prior to the ability of France to raise a very large sort of medieval army. And over the course of the war, it actually looked like England would win. After the first three phases, England controlled a great deal of territory in France. Areas like Aquitaine, which is in the area near the border of Spain, in the southwest of France, where areas like Bordeaux are located. This was controlled pretty consistently by the English throughout the war, and it was the connection, the marriage of Edward III to Eleanor of Aquitaine that actually gave them this right. There were also northern areas that were controlled. There was a time where the kingdom of Burgundy was aligned with the English. And much of the war also witnessed the English longbowmen, who in many of the paintings of this war, they're incorrectly placed at the front of the pictures of the paintings, when in reality the English longbowmen would have been behind at the rear, and they would have fired bows. They would have fired their arrows with their bow and arrows. They would have fired their arrows in massive waves onto enemy soldiers. And in many cases, those arrows could pierce the enemy's armor. The French were rather heavily armored, and this led to a lot of early victories for the English. Of course, famously, there's a number of famous events in this war, but famously, of course, Joan of Arc, who was ultimately captured by the English and was executed, burned at the stake. Joan of Arc, though very young, 19 years old at the time of her death, Joan of Arc famously rallied the French soldiers, believed that she had divine messaging telling her to rally the French soldiers, and Joan of Arc becomes a real heroine for the emergence of modern France in her efforts in the early 1400s to mobilize and to rally the French soldiers to take up the fight against the English more effectively. And this becomes a really iconic element of the ultimate emergence of the national identity of France, albeit a national identity in the sense that we understand it is still hundreds of years off, associated most with the French Revolutionary period of the late 1700s. Culmination. It's a war, yes, but it also this conflict witnesses the emergence and a transformation of warfare that's occurring. By the time you get to the latter stages of the war, you're starting to begin to see in the world the emergence of gunpowder weapons. And the 100 Years' War very much takes shape as a very medieval war, but eventually that old medieval style of warfare is going to give way to powerful gunpowder weapons. And it's in 1453 when the Islamic Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople, that they brought to bear on Constantinople, albeit primitive, but very large gunpowder cannons to address the walls of Constantinople, the great walls of the city of Constantinople, which would then become Istanbul. And so the old medieval form of warfare with walls and castles being, if you will, the most formidable form of defense, effective defense, really becomes a thing of the past. And you can kind of see that start to develop by looking at conflicts like the 100 Years' War and, of course, also the Ottoman Turks' conquest of the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, centered at Constantinople. Little fun fact really quick about this too. During the 100 Years' War, there was a famous battle called the Battle of Agincourt. And the Battle of Agincourt was a victory for the English. It occurred in 1415. And in the Battle of Agincourt, some scholars have imagined, surmised, that maybe the lewd gesture of giving someone the middle finger might have originated from that war, and from that battle. And here's why. In that battle, of course, as I mentioned, the English longbowmen were almost like a secret weapon for the English in ways. And to be a longbowman, bow and arrow, long bows that could fire arrows in high velocity over long distance, you had to be highly trained to do this. This was not something that somebody just picked up and did. Training for longbowmen began in people's youth. And so, in the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the French had reportedly taunted the English by suggesting that they would defeat the English on battle, and when they did, that they would cut off the drawstring finger of all of their longbowmen, so they could never be longbowmen again. And that, of course, is the middle finger. As it so happens, that battle was fought in a muddy, recently plowed farm field that had slopes on either side. And the French soldiers were all very, very heavily armored. And as the battle carried out, the soldiers sunk in the mud. They couldn't move around. Meanwhile, English longbowmen were raining down arrows upon them. And it winds up being a stunning victory for the English. And the lore is, and again, there's no way to verify this. This is just a historical imagining, really. But the lore is that following that, the English longbowmen all gave the French their bow finger, the middle finger. So maybe that's where that lewd gesture, which you should never, ever, ever display to somebody ever, let alone on a highway or something like that. It's a little interesting factoid for you there.